When a stranger walked up to Keanu Reeves on a regular Tuesday morning and handed him a small brown paper box, Keanu's entire world stopped. He was just getting coffee. Same street he had walked down 100 times. Same Los Angeles morning light. Same quiet life he had built carefully, privately, around a grief that most people never even knew he was carrying. The stranger said 4 words. "She wanted you to have this," and then walked away. No name, no explanation. Gone before Keanu could ask a single question. He stood there on the sidewalk holding this small, worn, brown paper package, and something in his chest told him that whatever was inside it was going to change everything. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. And when he saw what was in that photograph, this man, who had survived things that would have broken most people completely, who had buried his best friend, who had held a grief so heavy and so private that he had carried it alone for over 20 years without ever once asking anyone to notice, sat down on the dirty sidewalk curb of Sunset Boulevard and wept. Because what was in that box was the one thing he had spent 24 years believing was gone forever. Now here is what you need to understand before this story goes any further. Most people think they know Keanu Reeves. They know the movies. They know the memes. They know the image. The cool, calm, unbreakable man who dodges bullets on screen and gives up his subway seat in real life and never seems to need anything from anyone. But the real Keanu Reeves, the one behind all of that, has been carrying a loss so deep and so specific that the few people who know the full truth of it say it quietly, carefully, like something that deserves to be handled with both hands. He lost his best friend. Then he lost his daughter. Then he lost the woman he loved. All within 8 years of each other. Each loss, arriving before the wound from the last one, had come close to healing. And through all of it, every single bit of it, he never broke down in public. Never sold his grief to a magazine. Never made it into a story that was about him. He just carried it, quietly, completely, alone. Until that Tuesday morning, when a 61-year-old woman in a green wool coat and a knit hat walked up to him with a canvas bag over her shoulder and changed the entire direction of his life with a box she had been carrying for 23 years. What was in that photograph? Who was the stranger? Why had she waited 23 years to deliver it? And what was hidden beneath the photograph? The second thing in that box. The thing that Keanu did not see until he was sitting on the curb. The thing that made his hands go completely still in the middle of reading. The thing that was so much larger than even the photograph itself, that it would set off a chain of events nobody in this story could have predicted. That is what this video is about. And I need you to stay with me through the whole thing, because the part that will wreck you completely is not at the beginning. It is not even in the middle. It is at the very end, in a garden in Silver Lake, on a bench near a lemon tree, when 2 people who should never have found each other sat down and said hello for the very first time. Stay with me. This is the story of what was inside the box. There is a photograph that most people have seen without knowing what they were really looking at. It was taken on a New York City subway car sometime in 2010. The man in the photograph is sitting alone on a plastic seat, shoulders curved forward, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand, his eyes pointed at the floor between his shoes. He is wearing dark clothes. He looks like a man at the bottom of something. And the internet found the photograph and did what the internet does. It named it, packaged it, turned it into a joke. Sad Keanu. Within days, it was a meme. People photoshopped him onto park benches, onto the moon, into Renaissance paintings. It was funny, in the particular harmless way that other people's visible sadness sometimes reads as funny when you don't know the weight behind it. Here is what the internet did not know. The photograph was taken on April 2nd, 2010. April 2nd is the date that Jennifer Syme, the woman Keanu Reeves had loved, the mother of his stillborn daughter, died in a car accident on Cahuenga Boulevard in Los Angeles. She was 28 years old. The photograph was taken on the 9th anniversary of her death, to the exact day. He was not performing sadness for a camera. He did not know anyone was photographing him. Well, he was sitting on a subway in New York on April 2nd, alone, eating a sandwich, the way a person sometimes needs to be alone with their grief, in a moving, anonymous space where nobody knows your name or your history or what you have buried. The meme stops being funny the moment you know that. And that is the thing about Keanu Reeves that most people never quite reach. The real version of him lives on the other side of what is visible. The famous face, the movie roles, the action sequences, the fame that arrived early and never fully left. All of that is the surface, and it is a real surface. It is genuinely his. But underneath it, running like a current that never shuts off, is a private history of loss so specific and so compounded that most people, if they carried it, would not have gotten up again. He was born on September 2nd, 1964. In Beirut, Lebanon, which was already an unusual beginning for a man who would become one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces. His mother, Patricia Taylor, was a 20-year-old English showgirl working in Beirut. His father, Samuel Nowlin Reeves Jr., was a Hawaiian-born geologist. The marriage lasted 3 years. His father walked away when Keanu was 3 years old. Walked away is perhaps too soft a phrase. He disappeared. He returned to Hawaii and built a separate life. And the absence he left behind was not a clean break, but an ongoing, renewable wound. The kind that a child re-encounters every year on every occasion that requires a father to be present. Patricia moved, then moved again. Sydney, New York, Toronto. She was looking for something. Stability, a fresh start, and a version of life that fit. And she never entirely found it, though she kept trying with a persistence that Keanu would later inherit. He attended 4 different high schools across 2 countries. He was the new kid, repeatedly, in the specific exhausting way that being the new kid is never simply social discomfort, but a lesson, repeated until it becomes belief, that belonging is temporary and departure is always on its way. He was also, in spite of all of this, or perhaps because of it, someone that people were drawn to. Funny, unexpectedly. Generous in a way that didn't perform itself. His high school coaches in Toronto remember a kid who was a strong ice hockey goalkeeper. He was going to go somewhere with that, one of them said, decades later. Before the pull of acting redirected everything. Hollywood found him fast. A Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure in 1989 made him famous in the particular light, infectious way of a summer movie that everyone sees. Point Break in 1991 made him something more interesting. A screen presence that could carry tension without raising his voice, that could be still in a way that drew your eye rather than losing it. Speed in 1994 made him a different category of star entirely. The kind that studios wanted to own and audiences wanted to follow. He moved through it all like a man swimming in deep water. Head up, arms moving, always just enough above the surface to breathe. The success was real. The enjoyment of the work was real. But the private Keanu, the one that the people closest to him describe in careful, quietly protective language, was someone who laughed easily and grieved permanently, and who understood from an early age that the two things were not contradictions, but companions. His best friend was River Phoenix. This is a fact that younger audiences sometimes don't fully register, because River Phoenix died in 1993, and the internet was not yet what it is now. And grief has a shorter cultural half-life than fame. But River Phoenix was one of the most talented actors of his generation, and he was also, to Keanu specifically, the person who understood the particular loneliness of being young and famous and not quite at home anywhere. They were genuinely close, in the way that is rarer in Hollywood than the word friend usually implies. River Phoenix died of a drug overdose outside the Viper Room on Halloween night, October 31st, 1993. He was 23 years old. Keanu was 29. The Viper Room was partly co-owned by Johnny Depp at the time. River collapsed on the sidewalk outside. He was pronounced dead at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Keanu did not speak publicly about River's death for years. When he eventually did, in a brief, careful moment in an interview he clearly did not want to extend, he said, "I think about him every day." Not past tense, present tense. Every day. Grief, for Keanu Reeves, does not have an expiration date. This is not self-pity. It is simply the architecture of the man. He does not release things. He carries them forward, integrated into whatever he is and whoever he is becoming. And he continues. And then, 5 years after River, came Jennifer. Jennifer Syme was 24 years old when she and Keanu began their relationship in 1998. She was an actress and a personal assistant, and with a warmth that people who knew her describe in nearly identical terms. She made you feel like the most interesting person in the room, her friend Petra Haslam said once, in a private conversation that was never meant to be public. She was the kind of person who could pull laughter out of Keanu Reeves without trying, which was, by all accounts, a rare and particular talent. They fell in love the way two people fall in love when they are both lonely, in specific ways, that happen to fit together. Completely. And without a safety net. In 1999, Jennifer became pregnant. Keanu was 35 years old. And friends say, not for publication, not on record, but in the quiet spaces where truth lives, that he was more at peace than they had ever seen him. He talked about the baby. He talked about names. He told a close friend that he felt, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, like his life was not just moving, but arriving. Like he was finally pulling into a place, rather than passing through one. Ava Archer Syme Reeves was born stillborn on December 24th, 1999. Christmas Eve. She arrived into the world and left it before drawing a single breath. And the room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center went from anticipation to silence in the space of a moment. And the silence was the kind that doesn't fill back in. Jennifer and Keanu separated in the weeks that followed, not with anger. Grief of that size doesn't always produce anger. Sometimes it produces a tenderness that the two people simply cannot survive together. Because every time they look at each other, they see the shape of what is missing. They separated gently, but the grief between them too enormous for the relationship to hold. On April 2nd, 2001, Jennifer Syme was killed when her Jeep Cherokee veered off Cahuenga Boulevard in Los Angeles in the early morning hours. She was 28 years old. Keanu identified her body. He did not do a single interview for 14 months. He did not perform his grief publicly. He did not release a statement beyond the bare minimum. He simply went quiet, the way a person goes quiet when they have reached the outer limit of what language can usefully do, and he stayed quiet until he was ready not to be. When he came back, to work, to interviews, to the particular exposure that fame requires, he came back the same person he had always been on the surface. Calm, generous, still. A man who signed every autograph, who gave up his seat on the subway before anyone recognized him, who left enormous tips and remembered names and showed up early and stayed late and never, not once, made his grief into a story that was about him. He just carried it, quietly, completely, without asking anyone to acknowledge the weight. Until a stranger handed him a small brown paper box outside a coffee shop on Sunset Boulevard on a Tuesday morning in March 2023. And the weight, for the first time in 24 years, shifted. Her name was Dolores Vega. She was 61 years old, and she did not look like someone who changed lives. She looked like what she was, a recently retired nurse, small-framed, moving a little carefully because her knees had been complaining since 2019, and the chemotherapy she had started 6 weeks earlier was doing its own quiet damage on top of that. She wore a green wool coat that her daughter had bought her at a Macy's in Pasadena 2 Christmases ago. She wore a knit hat pulled down over hair that was thinning in the particular way that chemotherapy thins things. Not all at once, but in a slow, daily surrender that she had decided she would not be devastated by, because she had seen far worse in 31 years of hospital work, and she was not going to spend her energy grieving her own hair. She carried a canvas tote bag. Inside the canvas tote bag was a pale green shoebox. Inside the pale green shoebox was something she had been carrying for 23 years, and she was done carrying it alone. Dolores had worked the night shift in the labor and delivery ward at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles from 1991 until August 2022, when her orthopedic surgeon sat her down with the particular careful tone that doctors use when they are about to say something the patient already knows, and told her that her knees were not going to survive another year on hospital floors. She had cried in the parking lot afterward, not about her knees, about the ward, about the particular irreplaceable intimacy of that work, the way it placed you, night after night, at the exact threshold between absence and presence, between the world not yet containing a person and the world suddenly, permanently changed by one. 31 years, thousands of births. The full spectrum of what that means, the easy ones and the terrible ones, and the ones that started as one thing and became another in the space of a single monitor reading, a single change in a number on a screen, a single silence where there should have been sound. She had seen it all, and she had held it all. And when she retired, she spent the first 3 months sitting in her apartment in Eagle Rock, not knowing what to do with her hands. Her daughter, Marisol, was the one who noticed first that her mother was not adjusting. Marisol Vega was 28 years old, a 6th-grade English teacher at Roosevelt Elementary in Pasadena, with her mother's dark eyes and her late father's stubborn practicality and a way of paying attention to people that she had learned without knowing she was learning it. From watching Dolores work for her entire childhood. Marisol would stop by her mother's apartment on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and she would find Dolores sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular, her hands wrapped around the mug and perfectly still. It was on one of these Tuesday evenings in early October 2022 that Dolores told Marisol she had been to the doctor. Not the orthopedic surgeon, a different doctor, an oncologist, stage 2 breast cancer. Caught early enough, her oncologist, Dr. Priya Nambiar, had said that the prognosis with treatment was genuinely good. The word she had used was encouraging, in the careful way that oncologists deploy that word like a hand on a shoulder. But the diagnosis did what diagnoses do, regardless of prognosis. It rearranged the furniture of what mattered. It moved certain things from the category of someday into the category of now, and it moved other things things Dolores had been carrying for a long time without fully examining why, into the light. She told Marisol about the shoebox that same night. Marisol's first response, which she is not ashamed of and which her mother understood completely, was, "Mama, are you sure you're remembering this right?" She was sure. Dolores went to the top shelf of her bedroom closet, the shelf where she kept things that were too important to store casually but too private to display, and she brought the pale green shoebox to the kitchen table and opened it the way you open something that has been sacred for a long time. Carefully, with both hands, and inside, a pressed flower from her own mother's funeral in 1998, its petals still holding a ghost of their original color. A handwritten note on a torn piece of paper from a patient that said only, "You saved my life tonight." No date, no name, just those 5 words in shaky, grateful handwriting. A small ceramic figure of Our Lady of Guadalupe that had belonged to her grandmother. And an envelope, sealed, its edges gone soft with years. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Dolores slid it out and placed it on the table between herself and her daughter, and Marisol looked at it for a long time without speaking. The photograph showed a newborn baby, small, perfect, eyes closed, with the particular absolute stillness of a sleep that was not sleep. The baby's face was fully formed. You could see the nose, the bow of the lips, to the curve of the cheeks. She looked like a person who had arrived completely and simply had not stayed. On the back, in Dolores's careful handwriting, Ava, December the 24th, 1999. Cedars, Sinai. Marisol looked up at her mother. Dolores told her the whole story. Not quickly, carefully, the way she had been telling things to frighten people for 31 years, with a steadiness that made difficult information survivable. She had been the nurse on duty in the labor and delivery ward on the night of December 24th, 1999, when Jennifer Syme was admitted in her 8th month of pregnancy and the fetal monitor went flat and the room went through its terrible transformation from anticipation to grief. She had been there for the whole of it. She had watched the doctors do what doctors do, and she had watched Jennifer. She had watched the man in the gray jacket standing in the doorway. She had not known who he was, not immediately. She was focused on her patient, on the room, on doing her job, which in moments like that meant moving efficiently and speaking softly and being present without intruding on a grief she could witness but not touch. It was only afterward, days later, when the photographs from some press event appeared in a magazine in the break room, and she saw the same face, and something in her stomach turned over with a cold recognition that she understood. The man in the gray jacket had been Keanu Reeves. She had kept the photograph because of the ritual she had built for herself beginning in 1991, after losing a patient that she had never fully recovered from. She kept a small disposable camera in her locker. This was 1999. The phone cameras were not yet the universal document, everything tool they would become. And she photographed, privately, the things she needed to remember. Not as record-keeping, not for any file or archive, as ceremony, as her own quiet way of saying, "This happened. This was real. This person existed. And I was here." She had photographed Ava because Ava deserved to be remembered by someone who had been in the room. She had the film developed at a CVS on Wilshire Boulevard 3 days later. She put the photograph in the envelope and the envelope in the box, and she had never shown it to anyone, and she had never told anyone, and she had carried it for 23 years. She had tried to get it to him before, twice. Once in 2015, through a studio assistant contact she had met at a charity gala for Cedars Sinai. She had written a letter and given it to the woman and never heard anything back. And she had told herself either it reached him and he did not want to engage, or it never reached him at all. And both possibilities produced the same outcome, so she let it rest. Once in 2019, she had written another letter, sat with it for 2 weeks, and ultimately did not send it because she could not find a way to write it that did not make her sound like either a person with no understanding of boundaries or a person with a story to sell. She was neither of those things. She was a nurse. She held things for people. She had simply been holding this one for too long. The cancer changed the arithmetic. I need to get this to him before anything happens to me, she told Marisol. Not with drama, with the practical clarity of a woman who had spent 31 years understanding that some things needed doing now because there was no guaranteed later. Marisol looked at the photograph again. She was a 6th grade teacher. She had spent 10 years watching children encounter their first serious losses. Grandparents, pets, friendships that ended without warning or explanation. And she had learned, in the way you only learn it by watching it, that grief without witnesses is a specific and terrible loneliness. That unacknowledged loss doesn't simply sit still inside a person. It presses. She looked at her mother. She said, "Then we get it to him. Tell me everything you know." And she meant it as a practical statement. Let's assess what we have and build a path from here. But when she said it, Dolores exhaled in the way a person exhales when they have been holding a breath for 23 years and someone has finally told them they can put it down. The plan from that kitchen table in Eagle Rock began with a simple inventory of available options, and none of them were promising. But Marisol Vega was her mother's daughter. She had learned from the best possible teacher that the right thing and the easy thing were rarely the same path. She just needed to find the path. Marisol Vega was not, by nature, a person who gave up. This was not stubbornness exactly. Stubbornness implies a kind of blind forward momentum, a refusal to read the room. Marisol read every room. She was a 6th grade teacher, which meant she had spent a decade developing the specific radar that comes from managing 30 12-year-olds simultaneously, reading the 17 different emotional frequencies in the space at any given moment, understanding who was struggling and who was pretending not to struggle and who was about to cry, and who was about to cause a problem and who needed to be pushed, and who needed to be left alone. She was, in other words, someone who paid attention with her whole self, and then acted on what she noticed. She started with the obvious channels first, because that was the practical thing to do, and Marisol was practical before she was anything else. On a Thursday evening in mid-October 2022, she sat at her kitchen table in her apartment in Pasadena, a 2-bedroom she shared with her cat, at a large gray tabby named Copernicus, who had strong opinions about being ignored. And she opened her laptop and looked up Keanu Reeves' production company, Company Films. She found their website, which was clean and minimal, and offered a general contact email with the energy of a door that was technically present, but had not been opened from the outside in a very long time. She wrote the email carefully. She did not use Keanu's name in the subject line because she understood that subject lines with famous people's names in them were almost certainly filtered before human eyes reached them. She wrote, "Personal and time-sensitive, for the attention of someone in artist relations or personal management." In the body of the email, she was specific without being sensational. She explained that she was the daughter of a retired Cedars-Sinai nurse, that her mother had been present at a significant personal event in 1999, that she was in possession of something that belonged to Mr. Reeves, and would very much like to return it through whatever channel felt appropriate and safe. She reread it 4 times. She sent it. She received an automated reply within 3 minutes acknowledging receipt of her message and promising that someone would be in touch. No one was ever in touch. She waited 3 weeks because she was fair-minded and understood that organizations received a lot of correspondence, and that hers, however sincere, looked from the outside like any number of messages they likely received from people with sincere but unverifiable intentions. Then she tried again. A different email, same approach, a slightly different wording. She mentioned that the matter was medical in its urgency. Her mother's health was the reason for the timeline. She offered to provide documentation. She asked only for a phone number or a name, a single human point of contact who could hear her out for 5 minutes. The automated reply came in 2 minutes this time, identical wording. She put the laptop away and made tea and sat with Copernicus on the couch for a while and thought about what she actually had available to her and what she was willing to do with it. She considered, briefly, the press. A journalist she trusted, maybe. She had a college friend, Denise Quarshie, who worked for the Los Angeles Times and who was a genuinely ethical reporter, not the kind who turned private pain into traffic. But the moment she considered it fully, she dismissed it completely and without much internal argument. The photograph in that envelope was not a story for a newspaper. It was not content. It was not material. It was a dead child and a father who had never spoken her name publicly, not once, in 24 years. Whatever this was, it was the opposite of public. She crossed journalism off the list and did not revisit it. She tried a different angle in November, reaching out through a charitable organization. Keanu Reeves had been publicly associated with several causes over the years, and one of the most documented was his support of Sick Kids Foundation in Toronto, the children's hospital where he had reportedly made private donations for years, motivated in part, according to a 2009 piece in a Canadian publication, by his own experience of loss. She found a contact email for the foundation's donor relations office and wrote a carefully worded message explaining that she was trying to reach Mr. Reeves through an appropriate personal channel regarding a private family matter. The foundation replied, politely and promptly, explaining that they were not able to share or facilitate personal contact with their donors and suggesting she try his representation. She had already tried his representation. December arrived. Her mother finished her second round of chemotherapy and came through it with the particular grim determination that Dolores brought to everything that tried to diminish her. Dr. Nambiar's language was shifting slightly in the encouraging direction. The tumor markers were responding. The scans showed what the doctor called meaningful progress, see which in oncology vocabulary was practically a standing ovation. Dolores received this news with a nod and then asked whether she could resume her morning walks, because she had not been sleeping well and the stillness was making her restless. Marisol took her mother for menudo on a Sunday in late December and watched her eat with appetite and felt the particular complicated relief of someone whose fear has not disappeared but has been asked to move to a smaller room for the time being. On the drive home, her mother said, "Have you found a way yet?" Marisol said, "I'm still looking." Her mother nodded and looked out the window and said nothing else, because Dolores Vega understood, better than most people, that some things took the time they took. The path revealed itself in the second week of January 2023, so the way paths sometimes do, not through the front door, but through an entirely unexpected side window that had been there the whole time. Marisol had a student that year named Robbie Okoro, 10 years old, small for his age, with enormous glasses and a habit of finishing every assigned book 2 weeks before anyone else, and then sitting through the class discussion with the careful, neutral expression of someone trying not to visibly know all the answers. He was the kind of student that teachers quietly treasure, genuinely curious, not performatively so, with the specific quality of attention that meant he was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak. At parent-teacher conferences in October, Marisol had met Robbie's father. Glenn Okoro was 44 years old, a location manager for film and television productions in Los Angeles. The person responsible for finding and securing real-world locations for shoots, which meant he spent his working life knowing where productions were happening, which streets and buildings and neighborhoods were being used, and which crews were operating where. He was a pragmatic, efficient man who dressed practically and spoke directly, and had the particular unflappable quality of someone who spent their professional life solving logistical problems under time pressure. He had been, Marisol now remembered, peripherally connected to a production in 2021 that had filmed partly in downtown Los Angeles. She could not remember the specifics, but she remembered the name of the production had come up in conversation. Something about the locations being difficult. A night shoot near the Arts District, and she had a feeling, the particular feeling she had learned to follow, that there was a thread here worth pulling. She called Glenn Okoro on a Tuesday evening in January. She was straightforward with him, because Glenn Okoro was clearly a man who responded to directness. She explained that she was trying to reach Keanu Reeves through a private, personal channel. Not professional, not press, not anything commercial. She explained that her mother had been a nurse at Cedars-Sinai, and that she had something that belonged to him. She said she could not explain more than that without it being a longer conversation. But she was asking, did he have any idea, any at all, how a private person might reach him? Glenn Okoro listened to all of this without interrupting, which was itself a form of intelligence. So then he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't have his number or anything like that. I never worked with him directly. But I can tell you something I've seen with my own eyes, because I've been doing location work on Sunset for the past 4 months, and I've seen him 3 times at the same place. He told her the name, Groundwork Coffee, Sunset Boulevard, Hollywood. Tuesday mornings, Glenn said. Early, he's usually alone. He sits at the window or outside when it's warm. He's there maybe 45 minutes. I noticed because you notice him. He's hard not to notice. But he's just there having coffee like anyone else. Marisol wrote it down. Groundwork, Sunset, Tuesday mornings. She thanked Glenn. He said, I hope whatever it is works out. He did not ask any further questions, which she had not expected and was grateful for. She drove to her mother's apartment that same evening. Dolores was at the kitchen table, hands around a cup of tea, the pale green shoebox sitting on the counter behind her the way it always did now. Present, waiting. Marisol sat down across from her mother and told her what she had found. Dolores listened. She looked at the shoebox for a moment. Then she looked back at her daughter. Tuesday mornings, she said quietly, as though she was testing the weight of the information. Marisol said, I'll come with you. We can go together. Dolores shook her head, not unkindly, with the specific gentle firmness of a woman who had spent 31 years understanding the difference between support and intrusion, between being present and taking up space that belonged to someone else. No, she said. This one is mine to carry. She reached across the table and put her hand over Marisol's for a moment. Then she stood up, picked up the shoebox, and carried it back to the bedroom shelf where it lived. She had one more thing to add to it before she was ready. She had a letter to write. Dolores wrote 7 drafts of the letter. The first draft was too long. 4 pages, single-sided, in her careful handwriting, covering everything. The night of December 24th, 1999, in more detail than anyone needed, the 23 years of carrying the photograph, the 2 failed attempts to make contact, the cancer diagnosis, the way retirement had made the carrying heavier rather than lighter, as though the work itself had been the thing that made the weight manageable, and without it, the full mass of what she held had finally settled onto her completely. And she read it back and understood immediately that it was not a letter for him. It was a letter for herself, a confessional, an unburdening, and those were not the same thing. She folded it and put it aside. The second draft was too short. Half a page. Clinical, stripped of everything personal, which made it read like a document rather than a communication between 2 human beings. And the whole point, the only point, was that this was a communication between 2 human beings about something that no document could contain. She folded that one too. The third draft she crumpled before she finished the second paragraph, because she had started with an apology so large it swallowed everything that followed. And Dolores knew, from 31 years of delivering difficult information to frightened people, that leading with your own guilt puts your guilt at the center of the story. And her guilt was not the center of this story. The fourth and fifth drafts she wrote on consecutive evenings in late January, sitting at the kitchen table after 9 o'clock when the apartment was quiet, and Marisol had gone home, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street outside. These drafts were closer. She could feel herself getting nearer to the right words, the way you feel yourself getting nearer to a destination you have been driving toward in the dark. Not because you can see it yet, but because something in the quality of the road changes beneath you. She called Marisol on a Sunday afternoon in early February and read her the 5th draft over the phone. Marisol listened without speaking. And when Dolores finished, there was a silence of about 4 seconds, which is a long silence on a phone call. Then Marisol said, "Mama, the end, the part about the other night. Are you sure?" Dolores said, "I've been sure for 23 years. I just haven't been ready." Another silence. Marisol said, "Then it needs to be in there." Dolores wrote the 6th draft, incorporating her daughter's one suggestion, a single-line addition that changed the weight of the entire letter, that transformed it from a document of one thing into a document of 2 things, the second of which had been living in the margins of the first for over 2 decades. She read it back. She slept on it for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, she woke at 5:30, made coffee, sat at the table in the early gray light, and wrote the 7th and final draft from the beginning in one continuous sitting without stopping to revise, because she had learned over many years that the right words, once you had found them, needed to be written quickly before doubt arrived, and rearranged them into something safer and smaller than the truth. She sealed the letter inside a plain white envelope. She placed it in the pale green shoebox, beneath the photograph of Ava, so that the photograph would be the first thing he saw when he opened it, and the letter would be the second. She added a small white card, plain stock, the kind sold in packs of 50 at any drugstore, with her name written on it and her phone number in the same careful handwriting that had labeled the back of the photograph 23 years ago. Marisol had insisted on the card, it with the particular practical insistence of someone who had thought the whole sequence through more carefully than her mother, and understood that a letter with no return path was a door with no handle on the inside. She wrapped the shoebox in brown paper. She sealed the edges with tape, pressing each fold down firmly and neatly, the way she did everything. She did not write anything on the outside of the package. No name, no address. It was not going to be mailed. She put it inside the canvas tote bag. She was ready. The morning of Tuesday, March 7th, 2023, arrived with the particular mild indifference of a Los Angeles winter morning, which is to say, it was 61 degrees and cloudless, and the light had that clean, unhurried quality that the city produces in the early hours before the heat and the traffic and the noise reclaim it. Dolores was dressed by 6:45. Green wool coat, knit hat, the canvas tote bag over her left shoulder. Marisol had called the night before, ostensibly to confirm that Dolores had eaten a proper dinner, actually to make one last offer to come along. Dolores had declined it one final time, and Marisol, who knew when her mother's decisions were finished, had said only, "Call me the moment it's done." Dolores drove herself. 22 minutes from Eagle Rock to Hollywood, down the 2 to the 101, parking 2 blocks east of the coffee shop on a side street where the meters didn't start until 8. She walked the 2 blocks at her own pace, which was careful and unhurried, her knees reporting their usual complaints about uneven pavement, the tote bag a comfortable, familiar weight against her hip. The Groundwork Coffee occupied a corner position on Sunset Boulevard. Exposed brick exterior, large windows, a small number of outdoor tables on the sidewalk that were empty at this hour, except for a young man with headphones bent over a laptop. Inside, the space was warm and smelled the way good coffee shops smell, of roasted beans and something faintly woody. And the morning light came through the windows at an angle that made everything look, as Dolores would later describe it to Marisol, like the beginning of something. She ordered a coffee at the counter, a medium drip, because she was not the kind of person who had opinions about coffee preparation beyond the basic expectation that it be hot and real, and she chose a small table near the door where she could see both the entrance and the street outside without turning her head. So she wrapped her hands around the cup and she waited. At 7:53, she began to wonder whether Glenn Okoro's information was simply out of date. Productions moved, schedules changed, routines shifted. The man was famous. Famous people did not, presumably, maintain perfectly predictable public routines for extended periods without consequence. At 8:07, she caught herself doing the mental arithmetic of how long a reasonable person would wait before accepting defeat. And she told herself firmly that she had not driven 22 minutes and written 7 drafts of a letter and carried a shoebox for 23 years to leave after 30 minutes. And she ordered a second coffee. She also did not drink. At 8:17, she saw him through the window. He was walking east on Sunset, alone, hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, moving with the particular unhurried directness of a person who knows where they are going and is not performing the knowing. He was exactly as tall as she had expected from the films, and somehow also exactly as ordinary. He had the quality that very famous people sometimes have in person, of being simultaneously unmistakable and utterly unannounced, as though the fame is a fact about them rather than a thing they are doing. He came through the door. He went to the counter. He ordered. She could not hear what. But the barista smiled in the easy way people smile at regulars and reached for a cup without asking for a name. He pulled out his phone. He turned toward the seating area. Dolores stood up. She had rehearsed this moment many times in many versions. She had prepared words, organized them. She tested their weight. She had thought about how to introduce herself and how to explain without overstating, and how to hand him the box in a way that felt like an offering rather than an imposition. When the actual moment arrived, all of the preparation compressed itself into something much simpler and much more honest, the way preparation always does when it meets a real human face. She walked toward him. She was aware of her knees. She was aware of the tote bag. She was aware of being 61 years old and bald under her knit hat, and 6 weeks past her last chemotherapy session, and more frightened than she had expected to be, which surprised her, because she was not generally a frightened person. She stopped in front of him. She said, "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry to stop you. I was a nurse at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center for 31 years. While I was there on December 24th, 1999. She watched his face change. It did not change dramatically. He was not a man whose face did dramatic things. This was part of what made him so effective on screen. That stillness, that capacity to register enormous things with enormous economy. But something moved behind his eyes. Something that had been forward and present in his expression stepped back, very quickly, like a person stepping back from a window. He went very still. She reached into the tote bag and brought out the brown paper package and held it toward him with both hands. "I have something that belongs to you," she said. He looked at the package for a moment. Then he looked at her face, looked at it carefully, the way people look at things they need to be sure are real. And he reached out and took it from her with both hands. "The way you take something you understand is fragile," he said quietly. "What's your name?" She said, "Dolores." He said, "Thank you, Dolores." And then she said the 4 words. She had not planned them. They were not in any of the 7 drafts, not in any version of the rehearsed moment. And she could not afterward explain fully where they came from, except that they were true, in the way that some things are true before you have examined them. She wanted you to have this. She did not mean Jennifer specifically, and she did not mean Ava specifically. She meant something larger than both. Some force of unfinished love that had been trying to find its way back to him for 23 years and had simply needed a person willing to carry it far enough. She turned and walked out before he could respond, though because to stay would have made it about her. And it was not about her. It had never been about her. She walked east on Sunset, past the meter where she had been careful not to park, past a dry cleaner and a juice bar and a man walking a large confused-looking dog, past all of the ordinary texture of a Tuesday morning on a Los Angeles street. Her car was 2 blocks away. She reached it, unlocked it, and got in. She placed the canvas tote bag, empty now, lighter now, on the passenger seat. She sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, Los Angeles continued its morning with complete indifference, the way cities do, the way the world does, when something enormous has just happened inside a single human moment that the surrounding geography has no way of registering. Dolores put her head down against the steering wheel, and she cried. Not with sadness, not with relief exactly, but with the specific release of someone who has finally, after a very long time, put down something heavy and felt the full weight of it only in the moment of letting go. After a while, she raised her head. She took a breath. She picked up her phone. She called Marisol. When her daughter answered on the second ring, voice already tight with anticipation, Dolores said 2 words with the quietest and most complete certainty she had felt in years. "I did it." Behind her, 2 blocks west, on the sidewalk outside Groundwork Coffee on Sunset Boulevard, one of the most recognizable men in the world had sat down on a dirty concrete curb. He had opened a brown paper package with the careful hands of a person who is simultaneously terrified of what they are about to find and completely unable to stop themselves from finding it. He had moved aside the brown paper. He had lifted the lid of a pale green shoebox. He had seen the photograph. And then he had reached back into the box, because there was something else beneath it. An envelope. He held the photograph in one hand and the envelope in the other for a long moment, sitting on the curb while the Tuesday morning moved around him. A woman with a stroller, two men in work boots speaking Spanish, a delivery truck grinding through a gear change at the intersection. He opened the envelope. He began to read. And somewhere in the middle of the second page, his hands went still, and his face did something it very rarely did in public. It broke open completely. The letter began simply. "Mr. Reeves, my name is Dolores Vega. I was the nurse on duty in the labor and delivery ward at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center on December 24, 1999. I have kept something that belongs to you for 23 years, and I am returning it now because I am not well, and I cannot allow it to go undelivered. I am not asking for anything. I am not selling anything. I am simply a person who was present at something and has carried it long enough." He read slowly. He was not a fast reader under normal circumstances. He had spoken in interviews about being dyslexic, about the way text required a particular focused effort, about how he had learned to be patient with the pace at which words arrived to him. But this was a different slowness. This was the slowness of a person who is reading something and simultaneously absorbing it, letting each sentence complete itself fully before allowing the next one in. The way you move through a space you are afraid to disturb. The first page covered what Dolores had already told him in person. Her presence that night, the photograph, the ritual she had built for herself across 31 years of shift work, the specific human logic of why she had taken it and what it had meant to her to hold it. She wrote about Ava with a care and a plainness that was more devastating than any ornate language could have been. She was complete. She was perfect. She arrived into this world entirely herself. And I wanted someone to remember that besides the people who loved her, because love sometimes needs a witness who is not also broken by its object. Keanu sat on the curb and read this sentence 3 times. He had never heard anyone describe it that way. He had not known that anyone outside the immediate and devastated circle of that night had thought about Ava as a person, as a complete, specific, arrived person, rather than as a medical event, a tragedy, a loss to be notated and filed and moved past. In 23 years of carrying it, the dominant external language around what had happened had been clinical or quietly pitying, and both of those languages, however kindly intended, had always contained within them a subtle diminishment, as though Ava's significance was proportional to her brevity, as though she counted less because she had not stayed. Dolores had not written it that way. Dolores had written about Ava the way you write about a person. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. Then he kept reading. The second page was where his hands went still. Dolores had written it carefully, more carefully perhaps, than any other part of the letter, because she understood that what she was putting on the page was not a certainty, but a possibility. And the difference between those two things mattered enormously when the possibility in question had the capacity to restructure a person's entire understanding of their own life. She wrote, "There is something else I need to tell you, and I need to tell it to you honestly, which means telling you first what I know and then telling you what I only believe, and keeping those two things clearly separate so that you can make of them what you choose." What she knew. On October 14th, 1999, 10 weeks before the night of December 24th, 10 weeks before Ava, a young woman had been admitted to the labor and delivery ward at Cedars-Sinai in premature labor at 31 weeks. She had arrived alone. She had given a name at the intake desk that the staff had recorded, but that Dolores, writing the letter 23 years later, had reasons to believe was not her real name. She had no emergency contact listed. She was frightened in the particular contracted way of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has learned to make themselves small inside it. The labor had been complicated. A premature delivery at 31 weeks carries risks that a full-term delivery does not. See, and this one had moved through several of those risks in rapid sequence, and Dolores had stayed past the end of her shift, something she did more often than her supervisors technically preferred, because she was not the kind of person who handed off a frightened woman in active, complicated labor to the next rotation and went home to sleep. The baby had been born alive, a girl, 3 pounds and 2 ounces, breathing on her own, which at 31 weeks was already a particular small miracle. She had been transferred immediately to the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit on the floor above, where she would spend the next several weeks in the specific suspended world of premature infant care. Surrounded by monitors and careful hands, and the particular sustained hope of the medical staff, whose job it was to shepherd new life across the distance between arrival and survival. The mother had left the hospital before dawn, against medical advice. She had signed nothing. She had left no contact information. The name she had given at intake, when the hospital followed up, as hospitals must, resolved to nothing. A dead end. An address that did not exist. A phone number that rang out to silence. The baby remained in the NICU, listed in hospital records as Baby Doe, while the social work department initiated the process that the state of California required in such situations. The Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services was contacted. Emergency foster placement was arranged, and within 72 hours of her mother's departure, the baby had been transferred to a foster care facility in the San Fernando Valley. Dolores had followed up, as she always followed up. She had a quiet and entirely unofficial practice, developed over decades, of checking on the infants she had worried about. Not intrusively. She did not visit, did not contact foster families, did not insert herself into any official process. She simply asked questions of the people she knew, moved through the information channels that 31 years of relationships inside a large hospital system made available, and satisfied herself that the children she had worried about were accounted for and moving toward something better than what they had left behind. She had checked in January 2000. The baby was stable, thriving, are still in foster placement in Glendale. She had checked again in the spring of 2001, around the time the rest of the world was absorbing the news of Jennifer Syme's death, around the time Dolores was carrying 2 griefs simultaneously. The public reported grief of Jennifer, and the private, unwitnessed grief of the tiny girl who had arrived 10 weeks earlier and had no one looking for her. The baby, by spring 2001, was no longer in foster care. She had been adopted. A family in Glendale. 2 parents, stable home. No further details available through the channels Dolores had access to, because the adoption had been finalized and the records sealed in the way that California adoption records were sealed, which was completely and with the full and deliberate intention of giving the child a clean beginning, unencumbered by whatever had preceded it. Dolores had noted this, had felt the particular relief she always felt when a child she had worried about arrived somewhere safe and had let it rest. For 12 years, she let it rest. And then came the part of the letter where Dolores had written, "What I only believe." The part she had separated clearly and honestly from the facts. The part she had spent 23 years deciding whether she had the right to say. She wrote, "On the night of October 14th, 1999, when the young woman arrived at the ward, she was not entirely alone. When I came on shift, and walked through the entrance from the parking structure, I passed through the automatic doors, and I saw, briefly, in the lit frame of the entrance, a man outside in the parking lot. He was standing some distance back. He did not come inside. I did not think anything particular of it at the time because people wait in parking lots for many reasons, and it was not my business, and I had a patient to attend to. She had described what she had seen. Dark jacket, dark hair, tall, standing very still in the way that people stand when they are waiting for news they are afraid to receive. She had not seen his face clearly. It was late. The parking lot lighting was uneven. She had noted him peripherally and moved on. "I would not have thought of it again," she wrote, except that approximately 14 months later, I was in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon and the television was on, and a face appeared on the screen that I recognized before I understood why I recognized it. It was a promotional appearance. I believe it was for a film. I stood in the break room with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and I looked at the screen, and I felt something I cannot name more precisely than recognition. She had not acted on it. She had examined the feeling from every angle. The angle of professional responsibility, the angle of personal ethics, the angle of what it meant to be certain versus what it meant to simply believe. And she had concluded each time that she did not have enough. A silhouette in a parking lot, a feeling in a break room. These were not things you built a life-altering disclosure on. But she was 61 years old. She had cancer that was probably going to be survivable but had no guarantee written on it. And she had been a nurse for 31 years, which meant she had sat with more dying people than she could count. And she had learned from every single one of them the same lesson in slightly different variations. The things people regretted were never the things they had said. They were always the things they had not said. She did not want to die with this unsaid. So she wrote it, carefully, clearly labeled as belief rather than fact, giving him every caveat and every qualification and every honest acknowledgement of uncertainty that the thing deserved. And then, at the bottom of the second page, in the same careful handwriting that had labeled the back of Ava's photograph 23 years ago, she wrote the final paragraph. "I have thought about whether I have the right to tell you this for a very long time, and I have concluded that the right question is not whether I have the right, but whether you deserve the choice. You deserve the choice." The girl's name, when she was adopted, was given as Nadia. She would be 23 years old now. The family was in Glendale. I do not know more than this, and I am not certain of what I have told you. I am only certain that I have thought about it for 23 years, and I believe, in the deepest and most honest part of myself, that you deserve to know that she exists. Whatever you do with this is entirely and completely yours. I am sorry it took me so long. I am sorry I was not braver sooner. But I am glad, whatever happens next, that I found you. He read the final paragraph twice. Then he folded the letter along its original creases, placed it back in the envelope, and held the envelope and the photograph together in both hands. Around him, Sunset Boulevard continued its Tuesday morning with complete indifference. A bus exhaled at a stop half a block east. Two women with yoga mats walked past, talking about something that had nothing to do with any of this. The sun moved a fraction further along its arc, and the shadow of the building opposite shifted almost imperceptibly across the pavement. Keanu Reeves sat on the curb for a long time. He was not, by any external measure, falling apart. He was sitting still in the way he always sat still, with the quality of stillness that looked, from the outside, like calm. and was actually something closer to the absolute focused presence of a person who has decided, consciously or otherwise, to be completely inside a moment rather than managing it from a careful distance. He was inside this moment completely. After a long time, he stood up. He put the photograph and the envelope back inside the pale green shoebox and put the lid on and held the box under one arm. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he did the thing that said everything about who he actually was. He did not call a lawyer. He did not call a publicist. He did not call anyone whose job it was to manage the implications of what he had just read. He called Alexandra. Alexandra Grant answered on the second ring. She was in her studio in East Hollywood, a large, light-filled space that smelled of linseed oil and paper and the particular productive disorder of someone who works with their hands and their mind simultaneously. The studio walls were covered in her work, large canvases built around text, language rendered as visual form, words treated not as conveyors of meaning, but as physical objects with weight and texture, and the capacity to be beautiful or troubling, independent of what they said. She had been working since 7 that morning, which was normal for her, and her phone was on the work table beside her because she had been expecting a call from a gallery in Paris about a show in the fall. When she saw it was Keanu, she answered immediately, because she always answered immediately. Not out of obligation, but because she was a person who was genuinely present for the people she loved, and did not perform that presence. She simply practiced it, consistently, as a matter of character. She said, "Hey," he said, "I need to read you something." She set down her brush. She pulled a stool close to the work table and sat on it. She said, "Okay." This was one of the things about Alexandra Grant that the people who knew them both mentioned, unprompted, when they talked about what she brought to Keanu's life. She did not manage him. She did not redirect or reframe or offer the immediate consoling interpretation designed to make difficult things feel smaller and more survivable. When Keanu needed to be heard, she heard him, fully, and without the anxious helpfulness that is really about the listener's own discomfort rather than the speaker's need. She just said, "Okay." He read her the letter. He was sitting in his car by this point, parked on a side street off Sunset, the pale green shoebox on the passenger seat beside him, the mid-morning Los Angeles light pressing through the windshield with its usual beautiful indifference. He read slowly, the way the letter deserved to be read, not skipping the careful qualifications that Dolores had built into it, not summarizing the parts that were difficult to say aloud. Alexandra listened without making a sound. Not the silence of someone withholding a response, but the silence of someone who understands that a response is not yet what is needed. That what is needed first is for the words to exist in the air between two people, rather than only inside one person's chest. When he finished, he put the letter down. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds, which, as silences go, was the right length. Long enough to honor what had just been said, short enough not to become its own kind of weight. Then Alexandra said, "How are you sitting right now?" Not "what do you want to do?" Not "what does this mean?" Not any of the forward-looking practical questions that the situation would eventually require. She asked how he was sitting. It was a question about his body, about where he was in the present moment. And it was the exact right question because it brought him back into the immediate, rather than letting him disappear into the enormous and vertiginous implications of what he had just read. He said, in the car, on a side street, "I'm okay." She said, "You don't have to be okay." He said, "I know." A pause. He said, She described Ava as a person. Alexandra said, "I heard that." He said, "Nobody has ever, in 23 years, nobody outside of the people who were there has ever..." He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because it didn't need finishing. Alexandra had heard the letter. She understood what Dolores had done, which was to look at a stillborn child and refuse the clinical and social pressure to treat her as less than a full human arrival, to insist on her completeness in language, and to give that insistence to her father 23 years after the fact in a plain white envelope inside a pale green shoebox. Alexandra said, "She gave her back to you." He didn't respond for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." They stayed on the phone together for another 40 minutes. This is not a conversation that can be fully reconstructed because it was private in the deepest possible sense. Not private as in confidential, but private as in belonging entirely to two people and the specific love between them, and not to anyone else or any story anyone else might tell. What can be said about it is this: Alexandra did not tell him what to do. She did not tell him what to think, or how to feel, or what any of it meant. She did not perform wisdom or offer resolution. She simply stayed on the phone and was present, in the way that genuine presence, the kind that doesn't need to fix or direct or manage, is one of the rarest and most sustaining things one human being can offer another. When they finally said goodbye, she said, "Come here when you're ready." He said, "Tonight." She said, "I'll be here." He sat in the car for a while after the call ended. He picked up the photograph of Ava and looked at it again in the full light of the car interior. Looked at it properly, without the shock of the first encounter, with the steadier and more deliberate attention of someone who is choosing to see rather than simply reacting to what has appeared before them. She had his nose. He could see it clearly now. And something around the eyes, not the eyes themselves, because the eyes were closed, but the particular architecture of the brow and the orbital bone that he recognized with the cellular recognition of a parent, which is a recognition that does not require time or proximity to develop. It exists from the first moment, or it does not exist. And it had existed for Keanu Reeves on December 24, 1999, and it had not stopped existing in the 23 years since. And seeing her face again after all that time did not reopen a wound so much as it acknowledged one that had never actually closed. He held the photograph for a long time. Then he placed it carefully back in the box. He did not make any decisions for 3 days. This was deliberate. He had learned, through losses that most people could not imagine absorbing and continuing past, that the first responses to enormous things were not always the right responses, and that the mind needed time to move around something significant before it could be trusted to act on it wisely. He sat with the information the way he sat with most difficult things, which was to say, he kept moving. He went to work, he ate, he slept when sleep came, but he let the information exist alongside him rather than demanding that he resolve it. He was in post-production on a project. He showed up. He did his work. His collaborators noticed nothing different about him, which was either a testament to his professionalism or to the fact that Keanu Reeves always carried something invisible, and people had long since stopped being able to distinguish one invisible weight from another. On the second evening, he went to Alexandra's studio, and they sat on the floor among her canvases, and he talked, not about what to do, but about what he remembered, about Jennifer, about Ava, about the specific texture of that period of his life, which he had never described in full to anyone, not because he was protecting himself, but because he had never found a listener capacious enough to hold it without either flinching away from the difficulty or leaning into it in the wrong way, with the hungry attentiveness of someone collecting rather than receiving. Alexandra received it. She asked questions only when silence had run its course. She did not cry, which he needed. He needed her steadiness more than he needed her grief. She was steady the way certain people are steady, and not because they are unmoved, but because they have made a decision, conscious or otherwise, to be a reliable surface for the people they love. At one point he said, "I keep thinking about what it means if she's real." Alexandra said, "What do you mean by real?" He said, "If she's mine, if the letter is right." Alexandra thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "I think she's real, whether or not she's yours. She was born. She exists. She grew up somewhere. Those things are true regardless of what a DNA test would say." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not telling you not to find out. I'm just saying, she's already real. You're not deciding whether she exists. You're deciding whether to know her." This reframing, quiet, precise, and offered without pressure, was the thing that moved him from sitting with the information to being ready to act on it. On the morning of the fourth day, he woke at 5:30. He lay in the dark for a few minutes. Then he got up, made coffee, sat at his kitchen table, and called Dolores. He had her number from the small white card in the box. Plain stock, careful handwriting, just her name and 10 digits, placed there by a daughter who had thought the whole sequence through more carefully than her mother, and understood that a letter with no return path was a door with no handle on the inside. The phone rang twice. Dolores answered with the particular alert quality of a person who has been expecting a call and has not allowed themselves to fully believe it would come. She said, "Hello?" He said, "Dolores, and it's Keanu." A silence of one beat, the silence of someone absorbing the reality of a thing they had hoped for. She said, "Yes." He said, "I read your letter." She said, "I know. I hoped you had. I hoped it reached you properly." He said, "It reached me properly." He asked her questions. He asked them carefully, methodically, in the order that made the most sense. First about the night of October 14th, then about the young woman, then about what Dolores had observed in the parking lot, then about the follow-up checks she had made in 2000 and 2001, then about the adoption, then about the moment in the break room with the television. He asked each question with the focused patience of a man who understands that rushing the witness is the surest way to lose the detail that matters. Dolores answered everything. She was precise about what she knew and careful to flag every point at which she was moving, from fact into impression, from record into feeling. She apologized twice, once for the 23 years, once for the uncertainty, and both times he stopped her. The first time he said, "Please don't. You did something kind." The second time he said, "Uncertainty is honest. I'd rather have honest uncertainty than false certainty. Don't apologize for it." The call lasted 37 minutes. Before they ended it, he asked the question that Dolores would think about for a long time afterward. The question that told her more about who Keanu Reeves actually was than anything she had ever watched him do on a screen. He said, "Does she know she's adopted?" Dolores said she didn't know. And she said that in her experience, 31 years of it, some adoptive families told their children, and some did not, and that the practice had shifted significantly over the decades, and that she had no information either way about this particular family. He said, "Then I need to think about this very carefully. Not, I need to find her. Not, I need a DNA test. Not, I need to know if she's mine." The first fully formed thought he expressed about what came next was about the possible effect on someone else, about a young woman in Glendale who had her own life and her own story, and who may have been living it with no knowledge of the particular history that was now, on the other end of a phone line, sitting with a cup of coffee going cold on a kitchen table in the Hollywood Hills. Dolores held the phone for a moment after the call ended, and her daughter was in the doorway. Marisol had come over early, unable to stay away, and had sat in the kitchen through the whole call with her hands folded on the table and her face doing the work of staying neutral. Dolores looked at her. Marisol said, "Well," Dolores said, "he asked whether she knows she's adopted." Marisol said, "That was his first question about what to do?" Dolores said, "That was his first question about what to do." Marisol sat with that for a moment. Outside, the Eagle Rock morning was doing its ordinary things. Birds, traffic, a neighbor's dog making its feelings known about something. Then Marisol said quietly, "Okay, he's a good person." Dolores smiled, the small, private smile of someone who has known this for a while and is glad to have it confirmed. "Yes," she said. "He is." Her name was Nadia Osei. She was 23 years old, and she was the kind of person who occupied space without announcing herself, which is not the same as being quiet, and not the same as being shy, and not the same as being unremarkable. It was something more specific than any of those things. It was the quality of someone who had decided, early and without drama, that presence did not require performance, that you could be fully in a room without making the room about you. She had grown up in Glendale, California, in a pale yellow house on a tree-lined street near Kenneth Village, with a small front porch her mother had filled with potted succulents and a backyard her father had converted, over many patient weekends, into a functional vegetable garden that produced more tomatoes each summer than any four-person household could reasonably consume. The neighborhood was the kind that changed slowly and retained its character. Families who had been there for decades alongside families who had arrived more recently. A local library 3 blocks away that Nadia had visited so consistently throughout her childhood that the librarians knew her reading preferences and set books aside for her without being asked. Her father was Kofi Osei, 54 years old, a mechanical engineer originally from Accra, Ghana, who had come to the United States on a graduate scholarship to UCLA in 1992, and had stayed because, as he put it, with the particular dry humor that was his dominant register, the weather made it very difficult to leave. He had worked for the same aerospace engineering firm in Burbank for 22 years. He was a man who approached every problem, professional, domestic, personal, with a methodical thoroughness that his daughter had inherited so completely that people meeting them together for the first time sometimes assumed the trait was biological before remembering that it was not. Her mother was Linda Osei, née Hartwell, 51 years old, originally from Sacramento, a high school chemistry teacher at Hoover High School in Glendale, who had been teaching the same foundational curriculum for 18 years, and who managed, through some alchemy of genuine enthusiasm and specific personal warmth, to make the periodic table feel like something worth caring about. Students returned to visit her years after graduation. She kept their photographs on her classroom wall. Nadia had known she was adopted since she was 7 years old. Kofi and Linda had told her on a Sunday afternoon in October 2006, sitting on the living room couch with Nadia between them, with the particular prepared calm of 2 people who had discussed the conversation many times and had decided together that clarity and love were not in conflict, that you could give a child the full truth and also give them the full security of being wanted, and that, in fact, the 2 things reinforced each other rather than competing. They had told her that she had been born early, that her birth mother had not been able to stay, that she had spent several weeks in the hospital being cared for by doctors and nurses before coming home to them. They told her that she was chosen and loved, and theirs in every way that mattered. They told her that if she ever wanted to know more about where she came from, they would help her look, and that if she never wanted to know, That was equally valid, and that her feelings about it were allowed to be complicated and were allowed to change over time. Nadia had listened to all of this with the focused attention she brought to everything. Then she had asked one question. Was I sick when I was in the hospital? Kofi had said, "You were small, but you were strong." Nadia had nodded, apparently satisfied, and asked if they could have grilled cheese for dinner. This was, in its way, characteristic. Nadia processed things internally and thoroughly at her own pace, and did not feel the need to perform the processing for an audience. She had thought about being adopted many times over the years, had turned it over, examined it, or placed it in the context of her life and her family and her own sense of self, and had arrived at a relationship with the fact of it that was neither denial nor obsession. It was simply part of the particular shape her life had taken, and the shape of her life was, on balance, one she was glad to inhabit. She had not, in any serious or sustained way, gone looking for her biological parents. This was not repression. It was not fear. It was the considered position of someone who had asked herself the question honestly, "Do I need to know?" and had answered it, at least for now, with, "I have a full life that is already mine." She understood that this might change. She left the door open without feeling compelled to walk through it. She was, in the fall of 2022, a second-year nursing student at California State University, Los Angeles, with a concentration in maternal-fetal medicine. She had chosen nursing the way some people choose things, not from a list of options, but from a recognition, arriving gradually and then suddenly all at once, that this was what her particular combination of qualities was for. The steadiness, the capacity to be present in difficulty without being consumed by it. The specific attentiveness that her sixth-grade teacher, Ms. Vega, had noted in a parent-teacher conference with her parents when Nadia was 11, saying that Nadia had the unusual gift of making people feel seen without making them feel examined. She had chosen maternal-fetal medicine specifically because of a lecture she had attended in her first year of nursing school, given by a visiting obstetrician who specialized in high-risk pregnancies. The lecture had been about the particular demands of caring for patients whose outcomes were uncertain. Patients for whom medical intervention could do much but not everything. Patients who sometimes arrived at results that no amount of skill or care could redirect. The obstetrician had talked about the nursing role in those moments, not as a clinical function, but as a human one. The role of the person who stayed, who witnessed, who made sure that whatever happened, no one was alone in it. Nadia had sat in the lecture hall and felt something settle inside her with the quiet finality of a thing finding its place. She had gone home that evening and looked up maternal-fetal nursing programs. She had changed her concentration the following week. She lived in a second-floor apartment in Glendale, 12 minutes from her parents' house, which she visited for dinner every Sunday without exception. Her apartment had good light and not enough bookshelves and a small balcony on which she kept 2 succulents. The genetic inheritance, her mother said, laughing, of a woman who had been placing potted plants on porches her entire adult life. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Fit that had belonged to her aunt, and that she maintained with the same methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. Her best friend was Tamsin Rhodes. Tamsin was 24 years old, a graphic designer from Long Beach who had met Nadia at a campus orientation event in their first week of college, and had decided within 40 minutes of conversation that this was a person she intended to keep in her life. Tamsin was, in most measurable ways, Nadia's opposite. Loud where Nadia was quiet. Immediately expressive where Nadia was internally thorough. Someone who processed everything out loud and at speed, and felt genuinely better for having done so. They had sustained 5 years of close friendship on the reliable foundation of people who are different in the right ways, who complement rather than replicate each other, who make each other more fully themselves rather than less. Tamsin described Nadia, when asked, in 3 words: quiet, funny, enormous. She meant enormous the way you mean it about a river. Not the surface width, but the depth beneath, the volume moving underneath the visible, the capacity that you only fully understand when something tests it. On a Tuesday evening in late April 2023, Tamsin was at Nadia's apartment for dinner. They were making pasta. Tamsin was in charge of the sauce, on which she approached with the cheerful improvisational confidence of someone who cooked without recipes and had never once produced the same dish twice. Nadia was at the kitchen table with a textbook open in front of her, nominally studying, actually listening to Tamsin describe a conflict with a client about a logo redesign that had been going on for 3 weeks and had reached, by Tamsin's account, a level of absurdity that required live narration to fully appreciate. The letter was on the table beside the textbook. Nadia had brought it in from the mailbox that afternoon. It had been sitting among the ordinary correspondence of a Tuesday, between a utility bill and a circular from a local supermarket, notable only for being handwritten. She had opened it, read the first 2 lines, and put it down and looked at the wall for a moment before picking it up again and reading it through to the end without stopping. She had read it twice more before Tamsin arrived. She had not told Tamsin about it immediately, which was characteristic. She had needed to sit with it alone first, to turn it over in the private space of her own interior, before bringing it into conversation. But by the time the pasta water was boiling and Tamsin had reached the climax of the logo story, the letter was still on the table between them, and Tamsin, who missed very little, had noticed it. She said, "What's that?" Nadia said, "Read it." Tamsin wiped her hands on a dish towel and picked it up. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, while the sauce reduced on the stove behind her. And she was quiet in a way that Nadia almost never witnessed. Tamsin's silence was a rare weather event, and it always meant something significant was happening. She put the letter down. She said, "Nadia." Nadia said, "I know." Tamsin said, "He wrote this himself. This isn't... There's no lawyer language in this. He wrote this himself." Nadia said, "I know." Tamsin looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "How are you feeling?" Nadia considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She was quiet for long enough that the sauce on the stove made a sound, and Tamsin turned automatically to stir it, and then turned back. Nadia said, "I feel like I need to tell you something I've never told anyone." Tamsin put the spoon down. Nadia said, "When I started the maternal fetal program, and when I went to that first lecture and chose the concentration, I told everyone it was because of the obstetrician's lecture. And that's true, but it wasn't the whole truth." She paused. "The whole truth is that I have always felt, I don't know how to say this without it sounding strange, I have always felt drawn to that specific space. The labor ward, the NICU, the threshold between arriving and not arriving. I've never been able to fully explain it. I just felt pulled there, like something in me already knew the geography." Tamsin was very still. Nadia said, "I was born in a hospital, NICU. I was premature. I spent weeks there before I went home to my parents. I don't have any memory of it. But maybe..." She stopped. Tamsin said very quietly, "Maybe the body remembers what the mind doesn't." Nadia looked at her, and she said, "There was a nurse there when I was born, someone who stayed past her shift because my birth was complicated and she didn't want to leave." Tamsin said, "You don't know that?" Nadia said, "No, but I think it's true. And I think she's the same person who took care of a baby girl on Christmas Eve 10 weeks later, in the same ward, and took a photograph because she believed the baby deserved to be remembered. She picked up the letter. She said, "I'm going to be a maternal fetal nurse." Tamsin said, "I know." Nadia said, "That's what Jennifer wanted to be," before she changed direction. "I looked it up after I chose the concentration. I told myself it was coincidence." Tamsin didn't say anything. Outside the apartment, Glendale was doing its quiet evening things. The particular domestic hum of a residential neighborhood moving through the passage from day to night, unhurried, unaware that anything extraordinary was happening in a second-floor apartment on a tree-lined street 12 minutes from a pale yellow house with succulents on the porch. Nadia put the letter down on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has already decided and is now simply saying it aloud for the first time, "I want to meet him." Tamsin exhaled, a long, careful breath, and nodded. "Then we'll figure out how," she said. She turned back to the stove. She stirred the sauce. The pasta water boiled. And in a second-floor apartment in Glendale, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in late April 2023, a young woman who had grown up knowing she was adopted and had made her peace with not knowing more, picked up a handwritten letter and began, for the first time, to consider the particular shape of what she had come from, and whether knowing it might tell her something about where she was going. Nadia wrote back by hand. This was a decision she made consciously and without much deliberation, because the letter she had received was handwritten, and to respond by any other means felt like a reduction, like answering something offered at full human volume in a diminished register. She bought a pack of plain white paper from a stationery shop on Brand Boulevard in Glendale, the kind of shop that smelled of paper and ink and still sold fountain pens to people who understood why that mattered. And she sat at her kitchen table on a Wednesday evening with Copernicus. No, that was Marisol's cat. With her own quiet apartment around her, and the balcony door open to let in the mild May air, and the particular Glendale evening sounds of birds settling, and a neighbor's television and someone 2 floors down practicing, with patient imperfection, what sounded like a beginner's guitar. She wrote 2 drafts. The first was too careful, so hedged and qualified and measured that it read not as a response but as a negotiation, a document designed to protect her from the exposure of being genuinely seen. She read it back and recognized it immediately for what it was, armor dressed as communication, and set it aside. The second draft she wrote in a single sitting, beginning to end, not stopping to revise. She told him that she had read his letter 3 times before she responded. She told him that she had known she was adopted since she was 7, that her parents had told her with love and clarity and had given her the choice to look further, and that she had, until now, not felt called to. She told him about nursing school. She told him about the maternal fetal concentration and the lecture, and the feeling of already knowing the geography of a place she had never consciously been. She told him she was not certain of anything, and that she had sat with his letter long enough to know that uncertainty was not a reason to stay still. She told him she would like to meet him, if he still wanted that, and that she was not frightened, which was mostly true, and that whatever they found or didn't find on the other side of meeting, she was grateful that he had written in the first place and had written the way he had, without lawyers, without pressure, without making his need larger than her choice. She signed it. Nadia. She mailed it to the return address on his envelope on a Thursday morning, dropping it into the post box outside the stationery shop, standing for a moment afterward on the Brand Boulevard sidewalk in the early light with the particular feeling of someone who has just done something that cannot be undone and is not sorry. The reply came in 6 days. He had called Dolores in the interim. She learned this later from Marisol, who had heard it from Dolores herself, still slightly undone by the fact of it, to tell her that Nadia had written back. He had said simply, "She's extraordinary in her writing. Whatever happens, she's extraordinary." His second letter to Nadia was shorter than the first. It did not need to be long. It told her that he was glad she had written, that he had read her letter more than once, that the part about the geography of the labor ward had stayed with him in a way he was still turning over. It said that he would like to meet whenever and wherever felt right to her, and that she should set every condition she needed to feel safe, and that he would meet every one of them without question. He suggested, gently, a neutral location, not his home, not a public place, somewhere private and quiet that belonged to neither of them. He mentioned a friend's garden in Silver Lake. He said there was a lemon tree, so Nadia read this and smiled. The small private smile of someone who has received exactly the right detail at exactly the right moment. The lemon tree operating as the particular kind of specific ordinary image that makes a thing feel real rather than arranged. She wrote back that the garden was fine. She gave him 3 possible dates in the second half of May. She said she would bring her friend Tamsin, not into the meeting but nearby, because Tamsin was the person she trusted most, and having her close would help. He wrote back and said, "Of course, I'll have someone with me too." He meant Alexandra. The garden belonged to a woman named Cécile Marchand, 58 years old, a Franco-American set designer who had worked in Los Angeles for 30 years and who was one of Alexandra Grant's oldest friends, to the kind of friendship that had survived distance and difficulty and the various restructurings that life imposed on relationships over 3 decades. Cecile's house in Silver Lake was a 1940s California bungalow with a garden that she had tended for 20 years into something that felt less like a yard and more like a considered place. Walled on 3 sides with old brick, planted with rosemary and lavender, and a magnificent lemon tree in the far corner, whose branches spread wide enough to shade a full wooden bench, and the stretch of flagstone around it. Cecile had been told only what was necessary. She had asked no questions, which was one of the reasons Alexandra had chosen her. She had simply said, "The garden is yours for the day. I'll be inside. Tell me if you need anything." The morning of May 19, 2023, they arrived clear and mild, the particular quality of a Los Angeles late spring morning that is warm without yet being hot, before the summer asserts itself and the air thickens. Keanu and Alexandra arrived at 9:30. Alexandra made tea in Cecile's kitchen, moving through the unfamiliar space with the easy comfort of someone who has spent many hours in this house over many years. Keanu sat in the garden on the wooden bench near the lemon tree. He sat very still. He was wearing dark jeans and a plain dark shirt, which was what he wore when he was not thinking about what he was wearing, which was most of the time. He had his hands resting open on his thighs, not clasped, not fidgeting, just open. And he was looking at the lemon tree without seeing it, or perhaps seeing it very precisely, or the way people fix their gaze on something near and simple when their interior attention is somewhere else entirely. Alexandra brought him tea and sat beside him for a few minutes. She did not say anything. She put her hand briefly on his for a moment. Then she went back inside, because she understood that he needed to be alone in the garden when Nadia arrived, that the first moment of it needed to be unwitnessed. At 10:07, Nadia Ose came through the side gate. She was wearing a light blue shirt and dark trousers, her hair pulled back, and she moved through the garden gate with the careful, unhurried step of someone who is managing something large and has chosen steadiness as the strategy. Tamsin had come as far as the front door of the house and stopped there, hugging Nadia for an extra beat before releasing her, here because Tamsin knew, with the precise instinct of a person who loved someone well, that this was the moment to let go rather than hold on. Nadia came into the garden alone. Keanu stood up from the bench. They looked at each other across perhaps 15 feet of flagstone and lavender and morning light. And for a moment, neither of them moved. Not from hesitation exactly, but from the need to absorb, to let the reality of the moment catch up with everything that had preceded it. All the letters and the phone calls, and the drafts, and the decades, and the pale green shoebox, and the brown paper package on a Sunset Boulevard curb. Then they both moved, at the same moment, toward each other. They met in the middle of the garden. Nadia said, "Hi." He said, "Hi." She said, "You're taller than I expected." He said, "I get that a lot." And she laughed, a small, genuine laugh, surprised out of her. And something in the air between them changed, released, became breathable in a way it had not quite been in the first charged second of standing facing each other across the flagstone. They sat on the bench near the lemon tree. What happened in the 2 hours that followed belongs, in its fullness, to them. This is not a dodge. It is a recognition that some things require their privacy not because they are shameful or secret, but because they are sacred. And sacred things are diminished by full exposure in the way that certain kinds of light, brought into open air, lose their specific quality and become merely brightness. What can be said is built from the fragments available to the few people who were adjacent to it, without being inside it. Alexandra, who watched from the kitchen window for a few minutes before making herself look away. Tamsin, who sat in Cecile's front room with a cup of tea she didn't drink and her phone face down on the cushion beside her. Cecile herself, who moved quietly through her own house and noted, without intruding on, the sounds from the garden, the murmur of voices, the occasional silence, the quality of the air that changes around a significant human encounter, the way the quality of light changes before weather arrives. They talked for a long time. At some point, Keanu showed her the photograph of Ava. Nadia held it for a long time without speaking. She had known, intellectually, that there had been a baby before her, that if Dolores's letter was right about the parking lot, then the same man who may have been present at her own birth had also been present, 10 weeks later, for a loss of incomprehensible weight. She had known it in the way you know things you have read. Holding the photograph made it specific, made it a person, made the loss a shape she could see. She said, after a long time, "She looks like someone who arrived completely." He looked at her. She said, "I read that somewhere, in a letter. Someone wrote it about her." He said, "Dolores." She said, "Yes." He said, "I've read that line many times." She said, "Me too." They sat with that for a moment, the particular intimacy of two people discovering they have been moved by the same words, have returned to the same sentence, to have found in it the same shelter. At some point, she asked him about Jennifer. He told her what he could, not everything, because some things remained only his, but enough. He told her about the laughter, about the way Jennifer had made him feel like someone arriving rather than passing through. He told her about the grief that had followed, the particular compound weight of losing Ava, and then Jennifer within the same orbit of years. The way the losses had sat with him, not as events that receded with time, but as permanent features of his interior landscape. He said, "I'm not telling you this because you need to carry it. I'm telling you because you asked, and because I think you deserve the whole picture." She said, I can carry it." He looked at her. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, entirely present, but her gaze direct and calm, the specific quality of calm that was not absence of feeling, but the opposite, a complete willingness to be in the difficulty without stepping back from it. He recognized it. He recognized it in the specific way that certain qualities announce their origin. He did not say this out loud. Some recognitions are private. At some point, they talked about nursing school, about the maternal-fetal concentration and what it required and what it gave back. She described the clinical rotations with the particular lit quality of someone talking about work they were made for. And he listened with the full attention of someone who understood that capacity for genuine vocation was rare and worth honoring. And he said, "You're going to be extraordinary at it." She said, "I think I might already know some of why." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Because I was there once, on the other side of it. Someone stayed past their shift for me. Someone made sure I wasn't alone at the beginning. I don't remember it, and I don't need to remember it. But I think it shaped something in me anyway. The body remembers what the mind doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I'd like to meet that nurse someday." Nadia said, "I think she'd like that too." Inside the kitchen, Alexandra had stopped pretending not to watch. She was standing at the window with her tea cooling in her hand, and she could see the two of them on the bench near the lemon tree from the angle that the window offered. Not their faces clearly, but their posture, their orientation toward each other. The particular quality of two people who are no longer being careful with each other and are simply being present instead. She saw, at one point, Nadia's shoulders move in the way shoulders move when someone is crying quietly, without drama, just releasing something that has been held long enough. She saw Keanu turn toward her. She saw his hand come up and rest, briefly, on Nadia's shoulder. Not pulling her in, not managing, just acknowledging, just saying, "I see this. I'm here. This is allowed." Alexandra looked away then, not because it was too much to witness, but because it was exactly enough. And exactly enough things do not need an audience. She made more tea. She thought about a letter she had read aloud 6 weeks ago in a car parked on a side street off Sunset Boulevard, about a shoebox that had been on a shelf for 23 years, about a nurse who had photographed a baby because she believed the baby deserved to be remembered by someone who was not also broken by loving her. She thought about what Dolores had written at the bottom of her letter. The things people regretted were never the things they had said. She set 2 fresh cups of tea on a tray and carried them out to the garden. There is a particular kind of hope that grief destroys. Not all hope. Grief does not take everything. It leaves you the ordinary, forward-looking hopes. Tomorrow will come. The work will continue. The seasons will turn. The world will persist in its reliable indifference to personal suffering, and you will persist alongside it. Those hopes survive because they are structural, load-bearing, on the scaffolding without which daily life cannot be assembled and inhabited. The hope that grief destroys is something more specific and more tender. It is the hope of being known by someone who carries your particular history in their biology. The hope of looking at another face and seeing something of yourself returned. The hope that belongs, specifically and exclusively, to parenthood. Not the institutional fact of it, not the legal or social category, but the living experience of being someone's origin, someone's first world, someone's genetic echo moving forward through time in a body that is not yours, but came from you. Keanu Reeves had held that hope for 8 months in 1999. He had held it carefully, privately, in the particular way he held everything, without display. Without the performative anticipation that other people sometimes brought to impending parenthood. without making it into a story for anyone else. He had held it the way you hold something you do not want to drop, with both hands, all attention. He had bought a house. He had thought about names. He had told one close friend, just one, that he felt, for the first time in his adult life, like he understood what he was for. And then December 24th, 1999, had arrived, and the hope had not died so much as it had been placed somewhere unreachable. Not destroyed. Keanu Reeves had survived too many things to believe in the complete destruction of anything, but moved beyond access, placed on a shelf so high and so interior that even he could not quite see it anymore, could only feel the faint weight of it in certain moments, at certain angles, when the ordinary forward motion of his life slowed enough for the deeper currents to become audible. He had not expected to get it back. This is the thing that no amount of analysis or biographical summary or careful reconstruction of events can fully convey, because it is not an event. It is a condition. The specific interior condition of a person who has stopped expecting something without stopping needing it, who has made a functional peace with absence while the absence itself continues, unchanged, underneath the peace. He had not expected it back. And then Dolores Vega, 61 years old, bald under a knit hat, 6 weeks past her last chemotherapy session, had pressed a brown paper package into his hands outside a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, and the shelf had come down. Now Alexandra carried the tea out to the garden at around 11:30. She set the tray on the small iron table beside the bench and said, "I thought you might need these," and did not stay, because the situation did not require her to stay, and she understood this without being told. She went back inside with the particular grace of someone who knows when their presence is a gift, and when it is an intrusion, and has enough self-knowledge to tell the difference. Nadia wrapped her hands around the cup the way her mother wrapped her hands around cups of tea, which she did not yet know was her mother's gesture, which she had arrived at independently through some pathway that was either coincidence or inheritance, or the mysterious overlap between the two that no science has yet fully mapped. And she said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The letter you sent me. You said you didn't know if I knew I was adopted. What were you going to do if I didn't know?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lemon tree. A bird had settled in its upper branches and was making a sound that was more statement than song. He said, "I was going to find a way to make sure you could find it out on your own terms, without me being the delivery mechanism for something that destabilized your whole life before you'd chosen to engage with it." She said, "That would have been very complicated." He said, "Yes." She said, "You were willing to do something very complicated for someone you'd never met." He said, "You weren't someone I'd never met. Not exactly." She looked at him, and he said, You are, someone I've been aware of as a possibility for a long time, since Dolores's letter, and actually, in a different way, longer than that." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "After Ava, in the years after. I used to wonder whether there was a version of things where someone came from Jennifer and from me and was out in the world somewhere. Not because I had any reason to believe it, just because grief does strange things to the imagination. It looks for exits. It looks for ways to make the loss less total." He paused. "I never let myself take it seriously. It felt like the kind of wishful thinking that wasn't fair to the actual reality. The reality was that Ava was gone, and Jennifer was gone, and that was the whole of it." He looked at her. So, and then it turned out the imagination wasn't only wishful thinking. It was also, in some way I can't explain, picking something up. Nadia was quiet for a long moment. She said, "I want to be careful here. We don't know. We don't have anything confirmed. I might not be. This might be," he said. "I know." She said, "I'm not saying I don't want to know. I think I do want to know. I think I'll need to know eventually." He said, "Whenever you're ready, however you want to do it. On your terms entirely." She said, "What if the answer is no? What if the test says there's nothing there?" He looked at her directly and said, "Then I will have met someone extraordinary who chose to meet me without obligation, and sat with me in a garden and talked about things that mattered, and I will be glad for it regardless." She looked back at him, and she said, "You mean that?" He said, "I mean it completely." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has asked a question they needed answered, and has received the answer they hoped for, and is now allowing themselves to believe it. Then she said, quietly, "I think I mean it too." They sat in the garden for another hour. The bird left the lemon tree. The light moved. Alexandra, visible occasionally through the kitchen window, moved through Cecile's kitchen with the unhurried patience of someone content to wait for however long waiting was required. Tamsin, in the front room, had given up on the tea entirely and was sitting cross-legged on Cecile's couch, reading a design magazine she had found on the coffee table with the focused attention of someone who is using one thing to stop themselves from doing another thing. He's specifically walking to the garden gate and checking whether everything was all right, which she was not going to do because Nadia had not asked her to, and Nadia was the most capable person she knew. What Keanu and Nadia talked about in that second hour was smaller than what had come before. Or rather, it was the same size, but expressed in smaller things. The way enormous things often are, once the largest and most necessary parts have been said, they settle into the ordinary, the specific, the particular details that constitute a person's actual daily life, rather than their biographical summary. She told him about Glendale, about the pale yellow house and her father's vegetable garden, and the annual summer surplus of tomatoes that her mother turned into sauce and distributed to neighbors in glass jars with handwritten labels, and about the library 3 blocks away, and the librarians who had set books aside for her without being asked. About Tamsin's cooking, which was creative and unrepeatable, and occasionally alarming. He told her about Toronto, about the ice hockey goalkeeping and the 4 high schools, and the specific loneliness of being new, repeatedly, in spaces where everyone else had already found their people. About the way acting had felt, in the beginning, less like a career choice and more like the discovery of a room in himself that he hadn't known was there. A room where the displacement he had always felt became, somehow, useful. She said, "That's a good way to describe it." He said, "It took me a long time to find the words." She said, "I think that's why you wrote the letter the way you did. And I could tell that someone had taken a long time with the words." He said, "I wrote many drafts." She said, "Me too." They looked at each other, and both of them understood, without saying it, that they were the same kind of person in this specific way. People who took time with words, who understood that language was not merely functional but ethical, that the words you chose to say something were themselves a statement about how much you respected the thing being said. It was one of the first recognitions that was purely about them, not about history or loss or genetics, or the contents of a pale green shoebox. It was a recognition that arrived in the present tense and pointed, quietly, toward a future. They said goodbye at the garden gate at 12:47. Tamsin appeared in the doorway of the house the moment Nadia came back through the gate, and she looked at her best friend's face with the focused attention of someone reading a language they have spent years learning to be fluent in. and what she saw there made her exhale slowly and open her arms. Nadia stepped into the hug and held on for a moment. She said, into Tamsin's shoulder, "He's a good person." Tamsin said, "I know." Nadia said, "I don't mean famous person good. I mean actually good." Tamsin said, "I know what you mean." They stood like that for a moment in Cecile's doorway, with the Silver Lake morning doing its quiet, ordinary things around them. A car passing, a dog walking its owner up the hill, as the distant sound of someone's wind chimes in the specific light of a late May morning in Los Angeles that had no idea what it had just been the backdrop to. Keanu and Alexandra left separately, through the front of the house. Alexandra had her hand through his arm, and they walked to the car the way people walk when they have been through something together, and the something is still settling and does not yet require words. At the car, he stopped. He stood for a moment on the Silver Lake sidewalk, keys in his hand, the May light falling on him with complete democratic indifference. Alexandra watched him. He said, "She described Ava as someone who arrived completely." Alexandra said, "I heard." He said, "She got it from the letter. Dolores wrote it, but she returned it. She said it back to me without knowing she was returning it." Alexandra said, "What does that feel like?" He thought about it. He said, "Like something that was going one direction for a long time just shifted." She said, "Good shifted?" He said, "Yes, frightening and good. Both." She said, "That's what it feels like when something begins." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. They got in the car. He called Dolores that afternoon. He had her number still in his phone from the morning he had called to ask about October 14th, 1999, and the name sat in his contacts now with the particular significance of someone who had moved from stranger to permanent. The category of people who have done something for you that reorganizes how you understand your own life and cannot be moved back to any previous category. And Dolores was at home in Eagle Rock. Marisol was there. She had been there since 9 that morning, having called in a personal day to her school with the full and acknowledged reason being that she was not capable of sitting in a 6th grade classroom pretending to teach compound sentences when her mother was waiting to hear whether a meeting in a Silver Lake garden had gone the way they had spent months hoping it would. Dolores answered on the first ring. He said, "We met today." He heard her breath change. He said, "She's extraordinary." Dolores said, "I know." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because she was mine to watch over for a little while. I know all of mine." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Thank you, Dolores. I needed her to exist in the world. I just didn't know she was." She said, "She has always been. You just needed a path to find her." He said, "You were the path." She said, "I was one part of it. You were another. She was the largest part of all." He said, "How are you feeling? Your health?" She said, "Dr. Nambiar used the word remission last week." She said it carefully, the way doctors say hopeful things carefully. But she said it. He said, "Good. That's good, Dolores." She said, "Yes. I have things to stay well for now." After they said goodbye, Marisol, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway through the whole call with her arms folded across her chest and her eyes doing things she was not going to apologize for, came and sat across from her mother at the kitchen table. Dolores put the phone down. She looked at her daughter. Marisol said, "Well?" Dolores said, "They met." He called her extraordinary. She told him she wants to know. Marisol pressed her lips together. She looked at the ceiling briefly. Then she looked back at her mother. She said, "That shoebox sat on your shelf for 23 years. Dolores said, "Yes." Marisol said, And the whole time it was sitting there, she was 12 minutes away in Glendale. Dolores let that sit for a moment. She had thought about this, had thought about the specific geography of it. The way Nadia had grown up 12 minutes from Eagle Rock, had possibly driven past the Cedars Sinai building on the 110 100 times without knowing it was the building where she had arrived into the world, had lived her whole life within a 10-mile radius of the nurse who had been present at her first hour. She said, "Maybe that's how it works. Maybe the things that need to find each other stay near each other until someone is ready to carry them the distance." Marisol looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to remember you said that." Dolores said, "Write it down if you want. I have good days." And Marisol laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprised her. The kind that arrived from somewhere underneath the held breath of many months and broke the surface like something that had been working its way up for a long time and finally made it. The DNA test happened in July. There is not much to say about the fact of it except that it happened quietly, handled through a private medical provider that both Nadia and Keanu agreed on, with results delivered directly to each of them separately and simultaneously. And because this was what Nadia had asked for, to receive the information herself, alone, before any conversation about it. And Keanu had agreed without hesitation, because her autonomy in the process was more important to him than his own urgency to know. Nadia received the results on a Tuesday afternoon. She read them alone at her kitchen table in Glendale. Then she called Tamsin. Tamsin answered on the first ring and said, before Nadia could speak, "Tell me." Nadia said, "Yes." One word. The smallest possible container for the largest possible confirmation. Tamsin said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, Nadia." Not with tragedy, not with shock, but with the particular full-hearted warmth of someone receiving news that is large and real and deserving of the full human response. The response that doesn't try to manage or minimize, but simply opens completely to the reality of what has just been confirmed. Nadia said, "I'm okay. I don't know what I am. I'm okay." Tamsin said, "You don't have to know yet." Nadia said, "No." She looked out the balcony door at the two succulents in their pots. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, the particular gold of a Los Angeles summer afternoon, unhurried and complete. She said, "I need to call him." Tamsin said, "Go." The conversation between Nadia and Keanu on that Tuesday afternoon in July 2023 lasted 42 minutes. Neither of them has spoken publicly about what was said. This is as it should be. The confirmation belonged to them, to the specific private territory that two people establish when they begin the long, careful, unprecedented work of figuring out what they are to each other in a situation that has no established script and no cultural template, and must be built from the beginning, with patience and honesty and the particular courage of people who have already survived the worst things, and understand that surviving the worst things is the beginning of a particular kind of freedom. What can be said is that Kofi and Linda Osi met Keanu Reeves in August 2023 in the same Silver Lake garden, under the same lemon tree. Kofi shook his hand for a long time without speaking, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done, and he knew it. But Linda cried, and then apologized for crying, and then Keanu said there was nothing to apologize for, and then Linda cried again, which he said was also fine, which made her laugh. What can be said is that Nadia finished her second year of nursing school with the highest clinical evaluation scores in her cohort. What can be said is that Dolores Vega, in the fall of 2023, received the word from Dr. Priya Nambiar that her scans were clear, delivered not carefully this time, not in the hedged language of cautious hope, but directly, with the particular unguarded warmth of a doctor who is genuinely glad to be saying what she is saying. Dolores called Marisol from the car outside the clinic. She said 4 words. "It's gone. I'm clear." Marisol said, "Mama." Dolores said, "I know." What can be said is that Marisol Vega, who had kept this story to herself for the better part of a year, told her closest friend Elena over dinner one evening, not the full story, not with names, but the shape of it, the arc of it, because she needed, finally, to put some of the weight down somewhere outside herself. Elena listened without interrupting. When Marisol finished, Elena sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother carried a box for 23 years, and it turned out the box had a door in it." Marisol said, "Yes, that's exactly it." Elena said, "How does she feel now? Your mother?" Marisol thought about the last time she had seen Dolores, the previous Sunday, at dinner, the pale green shoebox still on its shelf, empty now, kept because some containers are worth keeping even after what they held has been delivered. She thought about the way her mother looked these days. Not heavier, not lighter exactly, but different, like a person whose center of gravity had shifted to a more sustainable position, like someone who had set down a specific weight and found, to their own surprise, that the setting down had not left them empty, but had made room. She said, "She looks like herself, the most herself I've seen her in years." The pale green shoebox still sits on Dolores Vega's shelf in her apartment in Eagle Rock. It is empty. She keeps it because she is the kind of person who understands that containers have meaning beyond their contents, that the box itself is a record of something, a physical monument to the 23 years of carrying and the one Tuesday morning of release, and that throwing it away would be a small erasure of something that deserved to remain. On the shelf beside it, in the space where the box used to sit alone, there is now a photograph in a plain frame. Marisol took it in May 2023 on her phone through the kitchen window of Cecile Marchand's bungalow in Silver Lake. It shows 2 people on a wooden bench near a lemon tree. Their faces are not clearly visible from this angle and in this light, but their posture tells the whole story. Both of them turned toward each other, both of them leaning in, the specific lean of 2 people who have found in each other something they did not know they were missing, and are now, carefully and with full attention, beginning the work of not letting it go. Dolores looks at this photograph sometimes, on the difficult mornings, the ones when her knees are particularly vocal, and the chemotherapy fatigue still surfaces occasionally like weather she cannot entirely predict. She looks at it and feels the particular thing she has felt since that Tuesday morning on Sunset Boulevard, when she walked out of the coffee shop and down the street and got into her car and put her head against the steering wheel. Not pride, not vindication. Something quieter than both. She had been a nurse for 31 years. She had stood at the threshold between absence and presence, between arriving and not arriving, more times than she could count. She had learned in those 31 years that the most important thing she could do in any of those moments was simply be there, fully present. A witness. Someone who made sure that whatever happened, no one was alone in it. She had been at that threshold twice in the fall and winter of 1999, once in October, once in December, and she had stayed, both times, past the end of her shift. She had not known then what she was staying for. She knew now. There is one more thing. It is the thing the story has been building toward without announcing it. The thing that sits underneath every other thing, the emotional truth that gives the whole architecture its weight. Keanu Reeves has said, in the few moments over the years when he has spoken about grief at all, that it changes shape but never ends. That the people you lose do not disappear. They become part of the structure of you, load-bearing, permanent, as real in their absence as they were in their presence. He has carried River Phoenix since 1993. He has carried Ava since December 24th, in 1999. He has carried Jennifer since April 2nd, 2001. He has carried all of them the way he carries everything, quietly, completely, without asking anyone to acknowledge the weight. The thing he thought was gone forever was not a person. It was the feeling that loss could eventually be answered. That grief, which had taken so much, had not taken everything. That the story which had seemed to end in that hospital room on Christmas Eve had not ended, had instead continued, in the particular indirect way that life continues when it cannot go forward directly, moving sideways and underground, and through the most unlikely of vessels. A nurse who kept a disposable camera in her locker, a daughter who called in a personal day to wait by her phone, a location manager who had noticed a coffee shop routine, a young woman in Glendale who had grown up 12 minutes away from the ward where she had first arrived into the world and had chosen, without knowing why, to go back. He had thought the chapter was closed. The chapter was not closed. It had been waiting, in a pale green shoebox on a shelf in Eagle Rock, in a second-floor apartment in Glendale, in a garden in Silver Lake with a lemon tree in the corner, for the people involved to find each other and do the slow, brave, unprecedented work of beginning again. Grief changes shape but never ends. And sometimes, if you carry it long enough, and if the right person is willing to carry it alongside you, it changes shape into something that is no longer only sorrow. Sometimes it changes shape into a door, and on the other side of the door, a bench near a lemon tree, and two people leaning toward each other in the late May light of a Los Angeles morning, and the quiet, enormous, frightening, good work of beginning. If this story moved you even a little, drop where you are watching from in the comments right now. It does not matter if you are in a small town nobody has heard of, or a city on the other side of the world. I want to know. Because stories like this one, about a nurse who held on to something for 23 years, about a man who carried grief quietly without ever asking anyone to notice, about a young woman in Glendale who grew up 12 minutes away from the place where her life began. These stories remind us that kindness exists everywhere, in every city, in every country, in every ordinary person who decides, quietly and without recognition, to do the right thing even when nobody is watching. If this story reminded you of that, hit the like button right now. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because every time you like a video like this one, you are telling the world that stories about real human kindness are worth spreading. That grief handled with dignity is worth honoring. That a 61-year-old nurse in a green wool coat who carried a pale green shoebox for 23 years deserves to be remembered. And if you are new here, and this is the first time we have met, subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. We find the stories behind the stories. The real weight behind the famous faces. The ordinary people who quietly change lives without ever making it about themselves. There are more stories like this one waiting for you right here. And I do not want you to miss a single one. Now go ahead and click on the video appearing on your screen right now. I picked it specifically for you, and I think it is going to stay with you just as long as this one did.